everyone. My name is Alex Badges, and I am the quantitative ecologist for MASERC here at the University of Minnesota. In this video, I'll be showing you how to submit new PI survey data sheets to our database using our new PI survey data app. So let me go ahead and share my screen. On this screen is the app as you see it when you first arrive at the URL, which you can see up here in my URL window. This is the landing tab or landing page for the app. If you want to know more information about the app, what it was designed to do, why we're doing it the way we're doing it, you can read this text here that's at the top of this page. You may also enjoy just playing around with this tab. This is a way to explore the database that we are building in short form. However, it's really going to be the submissions tab that you're going to be using to submit new data to our database. So I'll be showing you that tab here in a second. However, I want to quickly just navigate over here to the leaderboard tab, because this is the tab that we use to thank all the submitters and surveyors who have done all the work that has built the database that we are compiling here. And in particular, I think it would be useful for you to take a look at the entries in these two tables on this tab before you were to go to submit, because some of the first questions that the submissions tab is going to ask you when you go to submit a new data file is, who were the surveyors on that file, and who is the person or organization doing the submitting of this new record? And if you see yourself or your organization or some of your surveyors in these tables, you might want to represent their names as exactly as they are listed here, so that it is easy for us to add to the totals that are already displayed. If the surveyors or the organizations or submitters would be new or different, that's fine too. We'll add you to these tables. However, I would recommend that you stylize your name or organization's name similar to what is being shown here. In other words, full first and last names or initials are also fine, or organization names or submitter names. Okay, with that out of the way, I'll go ahead and navigate to the submissions tab. This is where you will send us new data files for incorporation into our database. There are some instructions at the top of this tab that articulate how this tab will work, but in essence, there will be a series of questions like a Google form here along the left-hand side. And then along the right-hand side, there's nothing right now, but a little later on, this is where your data set that you're working with, trying to submit, will be displayed. This will allow you to have sort of a vantage point of the data set that you're working with, so that you can keep track of any changes that are being made to it or answer any questions of it that the app might ask you. So I'll walk through each of these questions in turn. You'll notice that for a lot of these questions, there's actually a placeholder text that's in the box that shows you more or less what this input might be looking for from you. So you'll notice that some sort of name or name of an organization is what we're looking for here. Here we're looking for an email address. You'll notice that there are two buttons here. One to go back to the previous question. I'll talk more about that in a second. And then this one that just says answer the questions above to proceed. And you'll notice that when I hover over it, I get a little you can't do that symbol. This is our way of validating these questions. These questions are expecting you to put something into these boxes before you're allowed to proceed. This is so that we don't have any empty entries by the time a submission is complete. So the app will expect you to put something in these boxes, but as soon as you do, as long as it matches what we're expecting, this button will activate and it will allow you to move forward to the next question. So I will just go ahead and put my name in this box, since that's what it's expecting here. You'll notice the button has not changed yet, and that is because there is a second question up here right now. I will need to answer them both in order to be able to proceed. So I'll go ahead and put my University of Minnesota email address in here. I should stress that we're only gathering email addresses in case we have questions about your submission. So it's not that we plan on emailing you for any other reason than that. It would just be if we weren't quite sure what we were looking at based on the submission that you sent us. Now that I've put things in these boxes, you will notice that this button has changed, telling you click here to proceed to the next question. That's how you know you're ready to move forward. The app likes what you've put for the answers to the questions that you've given us so far. So if I go ahead and do that, you will notice that there was a little pop-up that popped up down here in the bottom right corner saying done with questions 1 of 16. There are 16 questions in total on the form. You'll notice they're not overly long individually, although there are 16 in total. So those little pop-ups, you can think of those as like a progress bar as you move your way through the app. You'll also notice that the next question just comes right on inside of this box. This second question deals with surveyors. So who are the ones who actually conducted the survey? And you'll notice here that that placeholder text indicates you should give full first and last names or initials and separate them with commas. If there are some people who want to remain anonymous but still get sort of anonymous credit, if you just put capital N, capital A, that will allow us to know that there was a surveyor there, but that surveyor is not being identified. So I'll show you that. I'll put Michael Verhoeven, and I'll put myself, and maybe there was a third person on our team who does not want to be identified, so I'll put NA for that. And you do not need to put and or anything like that in there, but it is helpful to separate the names with commas. Now, before I go ahead and hit OK here, I want to talk about the back button. Let's assume for a moment that you made a mistake in the previous question and you want to go back. You can do that. However, because this app is a very complicated piece of programming, right now you can only go back as far as the previous set of questions. You can't go any further back than that. So if you feel like you made a mistake much further back, you may need to reset the app and start over again. So don't be careful as you are going through the app, and don't plan to be able to go back any further than a single question. Feel pretty confident about the answers you put for each question before you'll go back. You'll also notice that now that I've hit the back button, I get a little warning down here. The back button probably doesn't work quite exactly as you were expecting. It is expecting that if you went back to these questions, it is because you wanted to change them. And even if you decided, actually, I think they're fine the way they were, you're still going to have to go back and edit the question in some capacity to be able to unlock the proceed button and go back to the question you were on. So I've done that, and now I can go ahead and hit OK and move back on to the next question. But you'll notice this button's now being locked again. It's now expecting me to have to manipulate this answer as well before I'm allowed to proceed. So put in a couple of spaces and then back them out or something like that to be able to proceed. So I would encourage you to use the back button sparingly because its use is a little cumbersome. I will hopefully improve that in future versions of the app, but it is trickier to implement a back button than you would think. So it works, but it will require you to edit anything that you've gone back to. All right, let's move on. The third question is a pretty straightforward one. It asks for the DOW number that's given to each lake by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. You may not know this number off the top of your head. If you do not, you can use the Lake Finder app to find that lake. You can search by lake name, you can search for county, you can search by nearest road or nearest town. You can do all sorts of ways to search here. And when you find individual lake records in Lake Finder, the DOW number of that water body will be listed there. If there is a leading 1 or a leading 0, which there are on some lakes, you will need to add that leading 0. You cannot skip it. So 0100100, for example, is a lake. It's Nelson Lake in Aitkin County specifically. So I cannot get away with, I actually I stand corrected. You do not need to put in that leading zero if you do not want to. The app will check to see whether or not a leading zero might be what you meant. But just in case, you should put that leading zero if there is one in the lake that you're considering. You'll notice that when you do put in a valid DOW number, you will get this little notification that says this is the lake and the county that this DOW number you've entered refers to. So it's another check that you've entered the number that you meant to enter. All right, well, we'll go ahead and move on. The fourth question asks, what day did the survey start? Sometimes surveys are done over a series of days. In this particular case, we're only interested in the very first day of that survey. So you can open up this box to choose a new survey date. If you need to go further back than a couple of months, you can click this button to go back several months, and you can even go back several years if you need to. So for example, if you're submitting one from July of 2018, you could go back that way. You can also back this backspace out here and enter a date if that would be easier for you. So you can do something like this, as long as you do it in month, day, year format, with the year being 4 digits. The app should understand what you're talking about there. All right, we'll go ahead and move on. You'll notice that a lot of those questions just disappeared. The idea is to try to not have too many questions on the screen at one time. So the app will sort of clear questions every 4 questions or so. But don't worry, they didn't actually go away. They're just hidden. It's just to keep the screen from becoming too bulky. If, for example, if I hit the back button, you'll notice that that date question comes back. I will have to now change my answer, even if it's just to change it back now, as we've talked about. But that answer is still being saved, and that question is still there. You'll also notice now that there is stuff on the right-hand side of our screen, and there will be basically for the rest of the way now. We don't recommend trying to do the submission process on a screen that's narrower. So anything that would be a mobile device, no tablets, no cell phones. If you try to minimize your screen or make it much smaller, you'll see that everything gets very scrunched and kind of hard to read. You'll also notice that there's a pop-up here that says, hey, we don't recommend doing this on a screen that's quite this small. So it will go away, but you'll notice that it's going to be a lot harder to navigate the app if you try to do so in a very small screen. So we're expecting you to use a larger screen for this most of the time, although you can do it on a smaller screen if you really want to. The other tabs, meanwhile, you do not get such a warning because those are pretty compatible with mobile devices and tablets. So you can view those not on a computer screen if you would prefer. All right, the next question is maybe the most important, and that is it is time to upload your new data file, which you can do by clicking this file picker here. Now, I should stress, and the instructions say this too, we are looking for your single raw tabular data sheet. We are not looking for a report. We are not looking for a file that contains multiple sheets. We just need a single sheet worth of information from a single survey. So when you click this browse tab or browse button here, you will bring up the file picker, which will allow you to navigate your computer and find a file that you can upload. Now, there are certain kinds of file types that are compatible. These include CSV files, Excel files. There are a couple of other files that are considered okay. Google Sheets files are not okay. Those are difficult to read in rShiny. So if you can download those as an Excel file or a CSV file, if you would like to submit those. And just to demonstrate that the app is smart enough to check what file types you are trying to upload, you will notice that if I upload a file type that is not supported, the button will actually change to tell you, hey, you're trying to upload a file that we do not know how to read. So I'll go ahead and upload a different file here. You'll notice that this is an Excel file, but there is only the one sheet in this file. It's not letting me preview that for you right now, but there's a single sheet in this file. If there were multiple sheets, as the instructions here say, we'll only get the first sheet. So keep that in mind if you're uploading Excel files. All right, Go ahead and hit OK. You'll notice the button changes back, recognizing that this is an OK file type. We'll now hit OK. And you'll notice that the right-hand side has changed. It was just a picture before of a file. Now it is a table showing the actual data file that I have uploaded. This is called a data table. It gives you the column names up here in bold. These were whatever was in the first row of your data table when it was uploaded. There's pagination control here, so we can change how big one page worth of data being shown here is in terms of rows. So if I want it to show me 100 rows at a time, I can do that by selecting that option. And you'll notice there's a scroll bar here, so I can scroll up and down. I can sort the data here or filter the data using this search box. It's pretty unlikely that you'll ever need to do that, but that functionality is there if you want it. You can also click these buttons here to sort the table. However, I don't necessarily recommend doing that unless that's really important for something that you're exploring here to answer the questions. I would just ignore that functionality. However, functionality that is very important is this scroll bar that's left to right. Your table is probably going to be pretty long left to right. So if you need to navigate over to the right-hand side, which you may need to do, you can just scroll down to the bottom here and you can use this left-right scroll bar to do that. If you need to see the end of your data sheet, you can click through these buttons down here to paginate through. So this data sheet that I've uploaded has 256 rows in it. And so I had to go all the way to the end to be able to see the last rows of this data sheet. So this data sheet now is a representation of the data sheet that I have just uploaded. You'll notice that the very next question here is asking, hey, this is what it looks like you've uploaded to us. Is this the data that you meant to upload? And all you have to do here is hit yes if that was true. Or if you've realized you've actually not given us the right file, or maybe you gave us a file with multiple sheets or something like that, and the sheet that it loaded in was not the one that you wanted to be submitting, you can hit no here, and that will open this back up so that you can submit a new file here if that's what you need to do. Although you can also go back to the previous question, which would also give you that option. I'm going to go ahead and hit yes, because this is the data sheet I meant to upload, and I'm going to go ahead and proceed to the next question. All right. This next question has some preparatory text attached to it. It's actually asking two questions, which is why there are two boxes here. At this point, the app is going to start asking you questions that help it clean and process the data so that the data you're submitting look like the data in our database, so that it's easy to glue those two things together. And one of the most important things is we need to make sure there's not any extraneous data left in your data file that our database wouldn't understand how to combine. So the first set of questions is about trimming the data set that you've submitted, getting rid of any rows or columns that don't need to be added to our database. So this first set of questions here is simply asking, where do your data begin or end in terms of row numbers in this table? So is the very first row in this table actual data from a survey? Like a rake was thrown and species or taxa were found? If so, okay, then one is fine in this box. If your data actually start down here somewhere, maybe they actually start in row 5 and there are instructions or something up here in rows 1 through 4, you're going to want to increase this number so that we have a higher number here. And I wouldn't worry about this. I don't know what this is talking about, but I wouldn't worry about it for right now. It's probably some message that's being reported for my benefit here. However, 4 is not necessary in our case because our data set actually does start at row number 1. So we're going to leave that box alone. Most of the time, I would guess it should be row number 1 where your data start. But this next question asks, where do our data end? And it notes that we don't want any rows containing summaries, incomplete data, notes or comments, empty rows, any of that sort of thing. So I'm going to have to go to the very last entry in my data sheet to be able to get a sense of where these data actually end. So I've gone ahead and navigated to all the way to the end of my data set. And you'll notice that this row here, row 251, looks like it's summaries. Like filamentous algae, for example, has 162 here. Well, there's no way that that was a rake score, right? So it looks like maybe these are counts of how often these taxa were observed. So this would be a summary row. It looks like these next couple of rows are empty, and then there's a stray number in one value of this next row. So it doesn't look like I would want any of these being submitted to our database. So I'm going to go back one page and just make sure that row 250 here is a normal data row from a single sample point. And that it does look to be the case. There are some observations here. There was a 1 as a rake score for filamentous algae. There was a 1 for small pondweed, and there were no other organisms noted on the rake there except for coontail, it looks like. So this looks like a normal row. The next row is not. So it looks like row 250 should be the last row that we keep in this database, this data sheet for submission. So I'm going to back this number down to 250, and then I'm going to hit proceed. All right, you will notice that before it said there were 256 entries or rows in this data table. Now you'll notice it says that there are only 250. And if I navigate all the way to the end, that last row I identified is now the last row in this preview. The app has now trimmed your data set vertically. It's gotten rid of any rows that don't contain point level data from your survey. Now we need to do the same thing widthwise. We need to get rid of any columns that contain any data other than data we would want to submit and include in our database. So these two questions are basically exactly like the previous two, except they have to do with column names. Basically, it's asking, where does your data start on the left, what column, and where do your data end on the right-hand side, what column? And so you'll notice here that there's this one column that got brought in that's just like point ID numbers. As it turns out, we don't actually need this column. We'll assume each row is for a single point, and we'll just give it point IDs on our end. So we don't actually need this column. It actually wouldn't hurt us if we left it, but we're going to just pretend that we're going to cut it. We don't need it and that we can cut it. So that means depth is actually the first column that we do want to keep. So we're going to go ahead and click the drop down here, and we're going to select depth as being the furthest left column that actually contains data that we need for our database. This next one asks, what's the rightmost column that still contains data in my data sheet? And for that, I'm going to have to scroll all the way over using the scroll bar. And the right-hand most column looks like it's a taxonomic column that could hold taxonomic data. So that's all right. I can go ahead and leave that column there. If there was an empty column over here that was blank or something like that, I could select this as being the last column to the right, and it would cut any columns to the right more than that. So I'm going to go ahead and hit proceed and show you what this looks like. You'll notice now that that column that had been being called 0 is now gone. It's been cut. So this is trimming work that would have normally had to be done by hand by someone on our end. Now you can do it right away for us really quickly by just answering a couple of questions, and that will speed up how quickly we're able to integrate these data into our own database. At this point, we're about halfway through the questions. The next question asks a very important question, and that is, do we need to flip your table around? So our database assumes that each row is data from a single sample location, a single point, if you will, inside of the lake. And then the columns are information about that point. Its depth, its substrate, its total rake coverage, and then the rake scores for each individual taxon that you were looking for at that lake. That's how we assume the data looks. However, I know that some folks store their data the opposite way, where taxa and depth and stuff like that are in rows and sample points are in columns. That would be backwards from what we want. So if your data are in that configuration, we're going to need to flip them so that they're in the same configuration as our data. And so if that's the case, you can go ahead here and use this drop-down menu to select, yes, flip my table. Now you'll notice my data is in exactly the form it's supposed to be in right now. Taxa are along the top and things like depth, and then each row is a sample point. So in this particular case, I should not be flipping my table, but I just want you to see what it looks like when we do this. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And you'll notice that it's flipped my data around. What was the very first column is now my column headers. And what was the column headers is now the entries in the first column of each row. So that's what this looks like. And we end up with a bunch of deletes and the data look a little funny. And that's because we probably shouldn't have flipped my table. And the good news is we can undo that. We can go ahead and hit back button here and we can say, no, don't flip my table. And you'll notice that even before saying that, it's flipped my table back into the configuration it's supposed to be in. So no, don't flip my table, and we'll go ahead and proceed. These next questions ask us about our column names. It's very important that no matter what you name your columns in your data set, we know where to put those data in our larger database, right? So we need to use standardized column names. What the app does now is does a little lookup to see, hey, okay, this is what you called your column names. This is what this row now would be what we would call your column names in our database. The reason that we do this is so that we know, okay, this is where, this is the column that this information should be going in, because our columns in our database are not going to be in the same order as they are in yours. They would have had different names. So joining those data together requires getting all of the names to be consistent. So what these questions now ask you is to check out the column names that we are about to sub in here and just make sure there's not anything that seems like it would be weird, that any of our column names seem like they're incorrect. This may be hard for you. It depends on how well-versed in scientific names you are. But as long as something here doesn't look really off, it's probably okay. For example, if you have a column that is taxonomic information and it's being marked delete, that means we don't recognize what you are calling that taxon, that common name or whatever you're writing up here. We aren't recognizing it, so we're trying to delete those data. This is where you should tell us about that. There's a comments box down here, and if there are some issues with our column names that we're going to sub in, I want you to tell us about that by selecting, no, there are some issues here, and writing these are the issues I saw in this comments box, and I will fix them once the submission process is done. And we'll add that to the lookup table that we use so that next time we'll know what you did mean by that column name that you had. The other thing to be watching out for is common names. Sometimes common names can refer to more than one scientific name or more than one species. So for example, large duckweed, in our lookup table, we assume that when you say large duckweed, you mean Sporodella polyrhiza. If that's not true, if you actually mean some other species, please tell us that so that we know that we need to change what this column is being called. And might we recommend that if you can, to use scientific names in your column headings from the outset for submission, because it will make this process a lot easier. Anyhow, this is basically just to check to make sure that the column names that we've now subbed in are as right as they can be, so that we join your data where they belong properly on our end. And so you could have said yes here too, if all the column names look okay. Say no and put some comments if they didn't look okay. And I'll check these on my end before we add these data to our database. All right, next question. Actually, the next two questions are relatively easier. The first of them is just trying to get a little bit more information about the data that you gathered. The first is that we are assuming you probably have depth data for each of your sample points. We just want you to tell us what unit those depth data are in. Are they in feet or meters or something else? And if you need to select something else, there will be a comments box at the very end. Please tell us what that unit was. Fathoms, furlongs, I don't know what it would be. It's probably going to be feet or meters, but in case it's something else, you can tell us that here. So I don't know what these are, actually. I'm assuming since they're relatively small numbers, they're probably meters, but I don't actually know. So I'll select meters, and then I'll go ahead and proceed to the next question. And then this next question asks, what's the highest value that your rake scale could take? So when you throw your rake in there and you pull it out and there's plants all over it, we usually score those taxa that are on those rakes in some sort of qualitative scale, ranging usually from 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 or 1 to 4 to 1 to 5. So in other words, what's the highest number you could have gotten on your rake? So looking at these data that are presented here, the highest number I see in here for any taxa is a 3. It could be a 4, it could be a 5. You actually may use half steps in your system, like 3.5 is the highest value that your rake could get. In other words, if your rake was absolutely covered in something, what number would that get? And here it looks like a 3 is the highest number it could get. So that's how I'm going to answer this particular question. If all your rakes do, if all you do for your survey for an individual rake is do presence absence, then the number that you should put here is a 1. And this is also explained here in the instructions. All right, just a couple more questions. We're on question 13 of 16 here. The next question asks, are there any records or rows in this data table that actually weren't throws? So we know sometimes you go out to a point and you mean to sample a point, but you don't sample that point for some reason. Maybe that point was too shallow, so you couldn't get your boat in there, so you didn't actually bother sampling that location. But there's still a row in the data table for that location, and maybe it just doesn't contain any data. We would call that row a non-throw. And we don't want to keep non-throw rows in our database. We only want to keep data from locations where you actually did sample, where you did actually throw or place a rake in the lake. So if you have some rows in here that are actually for non-throws, these next two questions are going to hopefully help us figure out where those are and how to get rid of them. So the first thing we would need you to tell us is what column has information that marks non-throws from throws. So let's imagine you had a column here that was didn't throw. And in that column, didn't throw, you sometimes have yeses, Ys. And Ys are locations where you didn't actually throw a rake. For this question, then, you would select that didn't throw column, that header for that column. I'm going to do that just to show you what it looks like. So I'm going to choose a different column. I'm going to choose this column instead because I need to choose a column here. But imagine that that was the didn't throw column. What you'll now get in this next question is it will ask you, okay, what values in that column mean you didn't actually throw something there? So in that previous example I just did, your Ys would be marking values of rows that you didn't survey for, right? So in here, in this dropdown, you would select that Y. And using that information, it would throw those rows out for you. Since I'm not actually going to do that, I'm going to go ahead and hit back. And this may not apply to you. Maybe you don't keep rows in your data set where you didn't throw rakes, and that's fine too. You can just skip this question by just saying no selection. And that's what I'm going to go ahead and do here because I happen to know that in this data set that I'm submitting here, there are no non-throw rows. So we don't need to worry about this. And you'll notice that if you selected no selection in the previous question, you don't even have to do anything for this next question. So bam, we're done with those two questions now. The second to last question asks, do you have spatial location data for your points or not? In other words, do you have lat long information or UTM information or something like that for each individual point that you surveyed? In other words, could I put these points on a map using that location data? So not location data for the lake, location data for the individual points. If so, this question is going to ask you about that. If there are columns in this data set that you are submitting that already contain that information, you can choose one of these two options. Yes, there is UTM data in here. Yes, there are lat long data in here. If it's UTM data, you might need to tell us the zone. I'm assuming it's zone 15. If it's not, please tell us that in the comments, which is the next question. Otherwise, that's probably what I'll assume that they are. If there are no location data anywhere, like you don't have that data for individual points, that's okay too. Just select no, I can't share those location data because I don't have them, or whatever this last option is. That's also a viable option. However, there is a fourth option. Maybe you do have location data for each of these points, but it's not in this file that you're submitting. It's in some other file, like maybe you have a shape file or another Excel file that contains those information. Go ahead and select this option, and then you'll notice that there's a file picker here. So you will be able to navigate to your computer wherever that information exists, and you'll be able to upload a second file here that has that location information, and we'll get that information on our end too, and we'll join those information in for you if that's something that we're able to do. So I don't actually think there are location data for these data. If there were, I don't have them. So I'm actually going to select this option that there are no location data, and I'm going to proceed to the next question. And you don't have to worry about this. If you did put a file in here, it's not going to worry about it if you didn't tell us that there was going to be a file. All right, this is the last question. Wahoo! You've made it. The very last question is simply an opportunity for you to tell us about anything that came up in any of the previous questions that you think we should know when interpreting your data and joining them to our database. So put any comments in here you would like. I'd especially love any feedback that we can get on this app. This is version 1 of this app, so we're going to be putting out many more versions as we need to enhance functionality. If there's something we could have done to make the experience better, we'd like to know that here. If you loved it, great, tell us that here too. But if there are any data issues or data clarifying you need to do, this is where you would do it. For example, if you have a substrate column, but maybe all it says is M and S for muck and sand, and you don't think we're going to be able to guess that on our own, you could tell that to us here. So you could like demystify some of the columns in your data set here if you feel like that's information we would like to know. You will notice that at this point, the button here that was moving us between questions is actually now saying, click here to submit. So that is what we're going to go ahead and do. Bam, I've hit the submit button, and you will notice that you get a little pop-up saying, hey, we're working to submit your files right now. So as long as that pop-up is up, you know something is happening. The submission process takes about 5 to 10 seconds. It might take a little longer if you have a slower connection, but you'll know that you've been successful when you get this pop-up that tells you, hey, we've got your data. Great, thank you for sending it. You'll also notice that there's this button has changed to say that the submission is complete. Thank you. So that's another piece of evidence that you've been successful. And you will notice now that there are 2 additional buttons now on the screen that weren't there before. You can actually download a copy of your cleaned data file if that is something of interest to you. Perhaps you want to try to follow a template to make submission easier in the future. Like now that you know what it is that we want, maybe you want to be able to make it easier to submit next time. You can figure out what that might look like by clicking this file here. And this will open up a download option in your browser. Mine's being slow, I think, but here we go. Let's try that again. I don't know why it's not actually just opening my downloader thing, but that's okay. Anyway, if you click this button, you should be able to be given the option to download your cleaned file. I'll have to explore why that isn't working for me right now here in a little while. But this will allow you to sort of see what it is that we're collecting and what we need on our end to tie things to our database more easily. And you can try submitting something that looks a lot more like our cleaned data file when you do that. Aha, it was just lagging. Okay, they all came up eventually. That's strange that it took that long, but you can see that the cleaned files now show up in my downloads. So you can check those out and you can see what those files look like. The other button here that's really important is this button. If you have multiple data files to send us, awesome, that's great. What I've done is I've designed the form to only partially reset if you hit this button, so that you do not have to enter every single thing all over again unless you really need to. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this button to show you what this looks like. And you'll notice that it kind of sort of reverts back to the beginning, except for example, these two buttons or these two inputs are already filled out for me. I don't have to re-put in my name or my email address here. I can just go ahead and click proceed to go right to the next question. If the surveyors are the same for this next survey, I can just keep these surveyors the way they were. If it's the same lake, it keeps the same lake here, which is actually probably unhelpful because it's probably going to be a different lake unless you're submitting multiple surveys across the same lake over multiple years or something like that. So if that's what you're doing, that's the lake that will be here when you get here, but you can, of course, change any of these inputs as you go along. The same date is also listed here by default now, but you can, of course, change it to a different one if you need to. And then once you get to this step, obviously, we're assuming at this point we're dealing with a different data file. So these questions will reset, but then the depth question won't reset. The rake question won't reset. So some of the questions don't reset because we are assuming you're going to give us very similar answers to those questions the second time around. So hopefully that will make it much faster to submit multiple data files in a row. All right. With that, I think I have covered everything that I think you should need to know to be able to submit. If not, though, my email address is listed down here at the bottom of the app. You're more than welcome to send me an email. You can also arrange to meet with me if you would like to maybe submit a data file together. I'd be happy to do that and sort of just be on Zoom with you and watch you submit a data file to make sure that you understand how to answer all of the questions properly. And I should note too, that if you run into any bugs or challenges as you go through the app, I would love to know those and I would love to fix them for you. All I would need ideally is a screenshot so that I can see the error happening in real time. If you can't get that, or if the app crashes before you can get that, it would be useful to have a series of events that preceded the error. What were you doing or what were you typing right before the app gave out on you? Because that's usually something I can recreate on my end and figure out what the problem was. And we saw an error or two that was popping up as we were doing this that I will now go in and fix because I've seen it happen and I hadn't seen that one happen before. So now I'll be able to fix that for us. And I hope your experience using the app is good. And I really appreciate that you are taking the time to submit these data to us. We really appreciate them and we really appreciate you. And I'm hopeful that I can make this submission process as easy and as seamless as possible for you over successive versions of our app.